Hi, I'm Pastor Tay of the Titus 2 Ministry and PastorTay.com. Welcome to Espresso. It's an interactive Bible study that is like espresso, strong and smooth. Enjoy the taste.
Dr. Don with you, Talk Live Tuesday, and our subject is conflict. All right, so what is conflict? What is conflict? Conflict is any serious disagreement or argument that is often protracted. In other words, it goes on and on and on. I like what Stephen Bishop said, I feel so miserable without you, it's almost like having you here. It's because of the conflict that he had, apparently, and he thought so ill of the person with whom he had the conflict that he wrote that. But harmony is desirable, but it's abnormal. However, conflict is undesirable, and yet it's normal. And that's the way it is this side of heaven. That's the challenge that we have, the difficulty that we have this side of heaven. And nevertheless, this is what God calls us to, is to live out the Christian life, the Christ-like life, as we address issues in life which are often filled with conflict and challenges and difficulties. So it's a serious disagreement, or it's a disagreement or argument that's often protracted and goes on and on and on. So what are the causes of conflict? Let's look at some causes of conflict. What do you think some of those causes are? Well, first of all, the first cause is transgression and sin. The first cause is transgression and sin. Ultimately, all conflict is a spiritual matter. It's an issue of the heart. Now, the root cause, as we know, is our broken relationship with the Lord, which goes back, it dates all the way back in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve when they rebelled against God. And that set them on the course. They sought essentially to do everything without reference to God. They wanted to be in charge. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to decide and communicate and relate and look at the world and their environment and interpret the world without reference to God. Well, we know that failed. And so what we have is, by replacing God as the subject of their affection and worship, and we do the same thing, they substituted idols, and we substitute God with idols. We have our own idols of the heart, and conflict often becomes a problem because of our idolatry, and worshiping ourselves or our things or our agendas or our world even more than God. This rift began with Adam and Eve, and it continued with Adam and Eve with each other, as well as between Adam and Eve and God. And it folded over into the relationship that they had with their own children, as we know that the account of Cain and Abel, where there was so much conflict between the two brothers that Cain had a problem with God, and so he took it out on his own brother, and he killed him. And so that's an extreme that we find with conflict. Sin can do that, and sin can have its effect. And sin can cause the rift between people and God. And so it can cause also, the effect of sin can cause brain damage, mental disorders, and other problems that we have. So certain disorders love drama. Certain people like drama. They enjoy drama. It fosters anger and wrath and so forth. And so they end up engaging in it or looking for it or continuing the drama of conflict and fights and arguments and so forth. So sin has its horrible effect. It also has its impact on people to cause such challenges as strife. In fact, Proverbs 15, verse 18, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. Proverbs 15:18. And so conflict is primarily due to a violation of loving God and loving others as myself. In fact, as I was reading about leadership in a leadership book or as a leadership journal, there was a study done in Canada with regard to conflict among leaders and within the business group, business settings. And what they found is, this is a quote from the study, the most common causes of conflict are warring egos and personality clashes, 86%, lack of honesty, 67%, stress, 64%. And clashing values, 59%. So it's not only among ourselves, and not only with family relationships, but it cuts across all ages, all kinds, all peoples, all relationships that we have, business or otherwise. But we're talking this evening most specifically about marriage relationship and the conflict that we have with one another. So at the core of conflict is our sinful condition or sinful pride. And it causes misunderstandings, a lack of judgment, or even an all-out war. James chapter 4 brings this out. Verse 1, James 4:1 says, "What causes quarrels? What causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" In other words, not getting what you want. And your intense desire to achieve your own personal goal or goals without any regard or consideration of the other person often calls for conflict and calls up conflict. So what do you think about that? Anyone have any thoughts or concerns? How are we doing? We get a thumbs up if anyone's around listening. All right. Well, then moving on. So the second cause of conflict is disconnection. Disconnection. Disconnection comes from, of course, a division between individuals. So, for example, there's a divide, if you will, different perspectives. Conflicts often arise because when you're dealing with a husband and wife, you have two different perspectives. You and your spouse are unique and different, obviously. And so it should not surprise you that you disagree and sometimes disconnect. That's just how life is. And in fact, Dr. Ash wrote way back in 1952, he was a scientist who looked into conflict, and he said, two people can interpret the same social interaction in different ways based on their own personal knowledge and experiences. How many of you see that to be true in your own life? You have conflict because of your own challenges, your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own perspectives. No? All right. So different perspectives. The next thing we have that causes disconnection is different agendas. Different agendas. Most often we come up in a conflict when one wants to do this and the other wants to do that. And so you might want to take a vacation and you just decide that you're going to have vacation, but one wants to go and have fun in the city and the other one wants to go up in the mountains or on the beach and relax. So conflict ensues because the agenda is different. And most often when we find relationships with one another and we're dialoguing and discussing, that we see this agenda disconnect happening with different agendas coming up in our lives. The next thing that we see is different intensities. Different intensities. Intensities of disconnection. Anything from miscommunication to separation. So disconnection is very disruptive and can cause social emotional pain depending upon the individual's perspective. So what might offend you may not necessarily offend your spouse, or what may offend him or her to a great degree might not offend you at all. It depends on your perspective. And the reason for that is because of your own makeup, your biology, your composition, your personality, your experiences that you've had, your relationships and so forth. And so what you do is you tend to come up with these different perspectives and you see the social emotional pain at different levels with each of you. So it's especially hurtful between married couple because what's happening when there's conflict between a husband and wife, you're beginning to tear at the very fabric of the relationship, that one flesh unity that Genesis talks about. One flesh unity begins to unravel or break or tear. And so it's hurtful. Oftentimes conflict is believed to be bad because it feels bad. And that's true. It often feels bad. However, not all relationships or conflicts, as we'll see in a moment, are necessarily bad. It just seems wrong because people have grown up and they believe that it's wrong to disagree, or you can't oppose another view, or you can't hold on to someone else's perspective that's against your spouse's perspective or view. And so they see it as being quite uncomfortable. And that level of discomfort, which is emotional discomfort and pain, is considered a bad thing. Most people tend to avoid conflicts. And the reason why most people avoid conflicts is because they don't like the pain that is brought up within them and that it causes for them. And by the way, I don't know if I've said this before, if you know this, but the brain center where the pain is located and where it's registered in your brain understands one thing: pain, either a little bit or a lot, very a little or extremely intense. And it doesn't matter whether it's physical pain or if it's emotional pain, it still registers in one place in the brain as pain. And so, yes, emotional hurt is legitimate and it's painful. And but in that regard, think about it, you might find something that's very disconcerting that brings up a memory or causes some difficulties and challenges for you, and it's very painful, but your spouse may not see it that way or feel it that way. And so there's that disconnect. Different intensities. There's different agendas, different intensities. One author wrote this: while asking participants in my workshop to think of a conflict they faced in the past, and they were to come up with a list of emotions, attitudes, actions, or metaphors that they often associate with the experience of that conflict. Generally, they mention anxiety, stress, insecurity, anger, frustration, violence, and so forth. And so the author goes on: recently, a client told me that he felt like being lost in a labyrinth, like carrying a heavy rock on his shoulder. And for many people, conflict is avoided because they don't want to feel that pain and suffer the pain. And that kind of disconnect, it causes that. Any thoughts or questions at this point? Do you have any thoughts, any feedback, any views? I'm going to take a sip of water while we're waiting for anyone. All right, well, how about looking now at the levels of conflict, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to levels of conflict. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's talk about the good. Can there actually be good conflict? Well, yes, this is what I mean by that, good conflict. Some genuine disagreements, if they're not handled rightly, can escalate into a conflict. And we have some biblical examples in the New Testament of this. If you can well imagine, the New Testament is supposed to be a place of peace and love. But it records the various conflicts that good people who love the Lord had with one another. Take, for example, the conflict between Paul and Barnabas, where they argued over the value and the relationship they had with John Mark. They didn't think he was of value, and they argued over their philosophy of ministry. And it became so heated and so intense that they agreed to separate and go their different ways. That was conflict. And it was conflict between two people that we consider saints. Or take, for example, Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. The Apostle Paul has a vehement disagreement in his dialogue with Peter and with James over doctrinal issues, mainly whether or not, and this is found in the book of Galatians, whether or not if a person who is not Jewish had to become Jewish in order to become a Christian. And Paul said no, and he made his case. And Peter was kind of hesitant about that, and he was waffling in his position. He should have known better because God had already visited him in a dream and talked to him about that. And so what they did is they had to hash out the conflict. And you get the sense of the kind of intensity that there was in this when you look at not only the book of Galatians, but also the book of Acts. And now we live justified by grace through faith in Christ, and not by becoming Jews or doing the law. And so thank God for that conflict, right? So it was a disagreement that became a conflict that turned out good. The third one is found in Philippians 4, where there's personal matters involved between different people, and Paul brings this out, and there was conflict. But all of these things would be considered good because the end result turned out to be good. And the conflicts were heated at some points, but the results were good. So the good conflict is when you have a disagreement that produces a good outcome. Dr. Savico says in one study that I read, he says, conflict doesn't destroy strong teams because strong teams focus on the results. You could put couples in there, or relationships between a husband and wife instead of teams. They're a team to a certain extent. Contrary to popular belief, the most successful teams are not the ones in which team members always agree with one another. And oftentimes, in the counseling opportunities that I've had when I've worked with a husband and wife, one end or the other thinks the conflict is bad because they didn't observe it. They didn't see it with their parents, whether they argued or not. And so they grew up thinking that conflict should never happen and disagreements should rarely happen. And they assumed that they couldn't work together if there was any conflict. And so in fact, it says instead they're often characterized, these teams, by a healthy debate and at times heated arguments. What distinguishes strong teams from dysfunctional ones is that debate doesn't cause them to fragment. Instead of becoming more isolated during those tough times, the teams actually gain strength and develop cohesion. These sorts of emotions are common when confronted by a conflict or a problem. But we should also recognize that these emotions put us in a state of mind that disempowers us. And nevertheless, we can work through it so that we're on the same track and working towards the same goal for a win-win situation. Any thoughts about that? How are you with conflicts? Do you enjoy conflicts? Do you hate conflicts? Do you avoid conflicts? Any comments? Well, I'll move ahead. Think of this. Do not assume just because you have a conflict that everything is bad and your relationship is over. Don't assume that. Don't consider that because you're having a disagreement and you often come up with different conflicts that your relationship is over. It's not. It's the way you perceive it, and we'll talk about how to address that and look at those things so that you can move ahead and forward together, sometimes on parallel tracks, but in the same direction as a team. So that's the good. The bad is this. A bad conflict depends on the extent of the disconnection. So when you have a conflict, you have a disagreement, you have a conflict, and then it becomes exacerbated or worse or bad or more difficult as it continues. So one person might not see an issue as a problem and the other person does. There's a disconnect in perspective. And so when the disconnect then becomes a matter where it begins to divide the couple, then that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. For example, the stereotypical toilet seat problem that couples have. One wants it down and the other one wants it up. And, so they argue over it. And it's the same old thing. Husband doesn't put it down, the wife doesn't put it up, and it's a fight to the finish. Who's going to win? And so it becomes a matter where it's no longer an issue of the toilet, but it's an issue of disconnecting from each other. That's not healthy and causes some bad feelings and bad problems in the bad relationship. The next thing that we see is bad conflict is when there is jammed communication. So first, when there's an extended disconnection, and then when there is a jammed communication. We talked about this a bit when we were talking about listening, developing listening skills. Interference, not listening to each other, talking past each other, or getting stuck. You get stuck in a rut, repeating the same things over and over and over again. So bad conflict is when there's jammed communication. Thirdly, bad conflict is when there is a lack of resolution. When there's a lack of resolution, where both people see the problem as a big challenge and there doesn't seem to be any resolution. You argue about the same thing again and again and again with no end in sight. And that can become not only disconcerting, but it can be wearisome and wear you down and get to the point where you just don't want to, you avoid each other. You don't want to work with each other at all. So remember this, I pointed out a few talks back, is that 70% of all marital conflicts are never resolved. 70%. I'm not sure how they did the study, but it was a longitudinal study that some group had done at some university where they found that 70% of couples, when they argue and have a disagreement and conflict, they never find any resolution to it. So what do? Well, they still work it out towards a mutually agreed upon goal or plan. For some, they disagree and then they agree to disagree. For others, they say, okay, let's try this out. You have your way, I have my way, let's try a different way, a third way. And so they figure out a way to make it work. Thirdly, bad conflict is when there is lack of resolution. Bad conflict is when there is a lack of resolution. And then fourthly, bad conflict is bad when there is condemnation. That's when things really get bad. When you get to the point where you're condemning each other and you're at each other's throat, and you have distrust and rising tempers, blame shifting, staking your own claim, taking what they say and twisting it so that you condemn them. That's really bad, and that's when it's bad. So you have good, you have bad, and finally you've got the ugly. You've got the ugly. What's the ugly? What is the ugly? Well, the ugly is conflict becomes ugly when the disconnect becomes more severe and the couple begins to attack each other. You see where it goes? It goes from disagreement to a bad, to something that's even worse, and then to the point where it's ugly. So it could be good, could be bad, and now we're at the ugly stage where maybe I ought to go from the top to the bottom, very, very ugly, where they attack each other. Proverbs 17:14. Proverbs 17:14 says, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. Excuse me here, but things are popping up on my screen that are sort of annoying. So the Bible pegs it, and it talks about this kind of conflict that becomes very, very ugly. So James chapter 4, verse 1 calls it war. The passions within you cause a war. Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21 identifies this kind of conflict, this ugly conflict, as contention. And in fact, it says contention is a work of the flesh. You think about this. Let me read this to you, what Galatians 5:19 and following say. Contention is listed as one of the main vices that God condemns. He says adultery and fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries. And those who practice these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. You catch that? Contention, where it's outright war between one person and another, between the two spouses, the husband and wife, can be as bad or as disgusting or as horrible as all these other things that God condemns. And they will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, that's not to say that if you do that, you're not going to make it to heaven. What that is saying is that it's one of the qualities or the characteristics of an unbeliever who doesn't believe in Christ and lives according to the flesh. So the Bible says it can be ugly, and then it's ugly when all-out war happens. And at this point, it can become wicked and evil. So, for example, the psalmist in Psalm 140, verses 1 and 2 says, "Deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Preserve me from violent men who plan evil things in their heart and stir up wars continually." So it really becomes ugly when conflict starts as a disagreement, elevates to the point where there is great contention, and then you're out to get each other, to prove you're right, to put the other person down, to condemn and to hurt. And so then you have this horrible, horrible war going on. All right, let me stop there and take questions. I talked about conflict as being the good, the bad, and the ugly. So any thoughts about that? Any questions? Anyone have any questions? You have any questions? None? All right. So let me wrap this up now. We're not going to have time to get into this part 2, essentially what to do about conflict. I want to talk to you about 5 different things of how to deal with conflict. And then hopefully at another opportunity, we'll discuss each and every one of these things at a deeper level so that we can understand what we can do when it comes to conflict. So the first thing that we ought to do or can do about conflict, and by the way, once again, there's no avoiding conflict. The only way to avoid conflict with another person is to live by yourself on some deserted island or up in some mountaintop or in a cave where nobody else is going to be around the rest of your life. But once you're involved in any other relationship with any other person, then you're going to have conflict and you can't help it. So you can't avoid it. It's a natural component of our condition. It's who we are and it's what we do. But what is in our power, though, is to decide to experience the opportunity for growth and for change or not to do that. So what's the first thing? The first thing that you can do and that we can all do about conflict is consider your core. Consider your core. What I mean by that is, like Matthew 7:1 says, check your heart out. Investigate your heart. Before you go and judge somebody else and condemn someone else, including your spouse, look at your own heart. Evaluate it. Look deep. Think about the question, why is this bothering me? Why am I so adamant? Why do I have to have my way? What is it about him? Or what is it about her that he or she is doing, or their agenda that he or she has that really bothers me? So you want to consider your core. The second thing is you have to calm down to communicate. Calm down to communicate. If you're in a situation where you're heated and you're angry and you're all worked up, the best thing to do is to stop and take a break and make a plan to come back and discuss it reasonably. Now, the break could be 5 minutes. It could be 20 minutes. You walk around the house, you do some exercise, you do something different, you don't think about it, and you just calm down. You need to do that. You have to calm down. And you calm down in order to come back and communicate. Now, what you may have heard of is oftentimes counselors will say, set a time and find a table. Find some particular spot that you can go off to be together between the two of you, and find a mutually agreed upon location and a place where you're not going to be upset about that particular place, such as a table, or set up, an arguing table, a card table where anytime you have to resolve something, you pull it out and you sit down face to face and you talk to one another about the issues. So calm down before you communicate. The third thing, any thoughts about that? Any questions? Calm down. Do you find it hard to calm down when you're all worked up? All right. Nope. Calm down to communicate. The third thing is communicate to comprehend. Communicate to comprehend. And what's important is you need to understand each other. You have to get to the point where you really sit down and you begin to listen, as we talked about the last time. Listening to one another. Listening with not only your mind, but your heart. You feel their emotion. You sense what's going on with them. And you investigate as much and as thoroughly as you can to really get inside the other person to understand where they're coming from. Because once you're able to understand and comprehend where they are at and why this is an issue for them and why it's so important, then perhaps you can get to the point where you say, all right, that's valid. I get it. I understand it. I still disagree. Or you might say, okay, I agree with that. But usually that diffuses the intensity of the conflict. So communicate to comprehend. And then you comprehend in order to connect. You comprehend in order to connect. After all, it's more important to receive what is said than to be right about what you want. Did you catch that? Oftentimes, it is more important to receive what is said than to be right about what you want. Comprehend to connect. And finally, the last one that we'll look at some time in the future is connect to cooperate. Connect to cooperate. Dr. Susan Heitler, in her book on conflict, says, conflict resolution is the process of trying to find a solution to a conflict. So what you're doing is you finally connect, you come back together for the purpose of cooperating in order to find a solution. So she writes, ideally, conflict resolution is collaborative problem solving, a cooperative talking together process that leads to choosing a plan of action that both of you can feel good about. And I think she's right on. That's true. So you want to connect in order to cooperate. So what are the 5 ways what to do about conflict that we'll look at another time? Consider your core. Calm down to communicate. Communicate to comprehend. Comprehend to connect. And then connect to cooperate. All right, well, that's the end of this conversation Tuesday night talk live here on Titus II Community Christian Marriage Support Group. And next time, what we'll be looking at is in-laws. Again, that's the subject. Dr. Tay will be back, and he will be telling us about some ideas and thoughts on how to deal with in-laws and how to resolve those issues. If you missed this section, you can always go to the Units tab, which if you're looking at your Facebook, it's on the left. If you're looking on your phone or iPad, I understand it's up above. So you look for the Units tab and you can go back. And there we have a whole collection of all the previous lessons that have been taped by a variety of different presenters. And then you can go to Espresso, the Espresso channel of Titus 2 Ministry. And Titus 2 Community has the materials and information there, and all the things are posted on YouTube. So go to the Espresso channel on YouTube so that you can see it again, or pass it on to somebody else and let them know of any of these subjects. I hope you will enjoy our next time, and that you'll follow up and visit us again, and you'll stay tuned on next Tuesday night on Talk Live Tuesday, and let other people know about it. It'll be again at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. By the way, you all want to pray for the East Coast as the hurricane is barreling down. So pray for them, and pray for safety, and that it's not as bad as they predict. It's been good to be with you. Good night, and God bless you all.
Thanks for joining us for a devotional drink today. If you love Espresso, click here to subscribe so you know when the next one is ready to enjoy. Visit our website for resources for every chapter of your life. And if you're thirsty for more, click here. See you next time. May God bless your day.